Thank you for joining me this afternoon. I was thinking about the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, and little remarks somehow stick out in my mind. And one of them was when Brett Kavanaugh, in discussing his his condition during his high school years, 35 years ago, mentioned the influence of several movies that were popular back then, Animal House among them, and several others in the popular culture. High Times at Ridgemont High. There were a couple of other movies that, when you look at these movies, they popularized and promoted teen sex and teen drunkenness and teen parties as being somehow funny and glorious and amusing. They were part of the whole sexual revolution, the pushing of the envelope, the introduction of free sex and free love and sexuality as being something that was a good thing, and the more the better. And in a sense, it was holding up as an ideal the concept codified by Sigmund Freud in the 19th century, polymorphous perversity, which is to say that the ultimate virtue was any form of sex at any time, anywhere, without any moral or spiritual component attached to it, that indeed any restrictions like that were seen as repressed. In other words, that there was something mentally wrong with you if you held such ideas, that the ultimate good was a shedding of those things, and that expression and pleasure was the ultimate purpose in life. The will to pleasure is a very basic principle of Freudian psychology. The idea was further codified, of course, during the Bolshevik Revolution by Alexandra Kollontai, who was a major Bolshevik thinker. She was apparently a lover of Lenin's, and she codified this idea of winged eros versus unwinged eros. Winged eros was sexuality attached to relationships, commitments, love, fidelity, and that was bad. Unwinged eros was when you take those things away and that sex becomes nothing more significant than having a drink of water. That was good. That's the ultimate goal. And it was that ethos that was really started to percolate in our society in the 1960s, partially as a result of some of the Marxist thinkers at the Frankfurt Institute, people like Herbert Marcuse, who was one of the Pied Pipers of free love, and which culminated in the 1970s and early 1980s. And people like Brett Kavanaugh and Bill Clinton, these people were products of this. They were influenced by it. It was in the atmosphere. So, putting aside the question of whether or not Brett Kavanaugh engaged in drunkenness and free sex, when he was a teenager in high school and his first years in college, which is something that's, I would contend, actually is quite personal, and we have no idea. I think it's safe to say that this was part of the ethos. It was apparently part of the ethos of the accuser of Brett Kavanaugh, that being Christine Blasey Ford, who had a beer at this party, according to her testimony, in the middle of the day, and who, it was revealed later, led somewhat of a promiscuous life while she lived on the Rehoboth Beach in Delaware as a young woman. And I'm not saying this to disparage. This was the culture. This was what Bill Clinton was doing back then, when he was in college, probably when he was in high school. And yet the difference between Bill Clinton and Brett Kavanaugh is that Brett Kavanaugh, for various reasons, it might have been his Catholic background, it might have been that he became more conservative. However it came about, he cleaned up his act, if he was ever doing those things. And again, I'm not commenting on that. I have no idea. He cleaned up his act. He became a respectable citizen. He became an honored member of the judiciary, certainly as a federal judge and as a student at Yale eventually. Since then, he drinks moderately. anyway, I'm sorry about that. He's a moderate drinker since then. Let me just X out of this. And he's led a productive life. Now, in the case of Bill Clinton, it's safe to say that he also led a productive life, but he never really totally disavowed the lifestyle. Maybe that's because he's liberal. Maybe that's because he saw power as something that was an end in and of itself, and that as long as he tilted in the direction of power, he would be protected. He could get away with it, which was why Bill Clinton, the accusations were not against him as a drunk teenager at a party or even in his first or second year of college. His accusations came when he was governor of Arkansas, and he was accused of brutal rape by Juanita Broderick, and even in the White House, by Kathleen Willey, who he apparently sexually mauled in the Oval Office, and Paula Jones. That was while he was governor of Arkansas. Not to mention Monica Lewinsky, she wasn't a minor. I guess Hillary tells us she was an adult, so apparently it's okay. But it was an extremely unbalanced relationship that is a classic definition of sexual harassment. When he was messing around with her in the Oval Office. So Clinton continued this behavior and apparently still does. He went to that Lolita Island with that pedophile Epstein, flown out there, told his Secret Service to stay behind. So, he's still, a participant in the sexual revolution that he learned as a young man because of the culture, whereas Brett Kavanaugh, whether he ever was is beside the point. He's cleaned up his act. And so that brings me to an observation about how the left approaches this matter. On the one hand, the whole thing, the sexual revolution, polymorphous perversity by Freud, Alexandra Kollontai and her unwinged Eros, Herbert Marcuse, the Pied Piper of the sexual revolution, free love movement. These are ideals of the left, and yet we see their situational approach to it today with the Me Too movement, in that they can then apply suddenly a hyper-puritanical view when the person involved in who's being accused is not properly on the left. They are not genuflecting in the left direction. They can be accused. They can be destroyed of not only doing the things that left-wingers have done as well, but things the left-wingers glorified in the culture and honored. So therefore, you can go after a man like Brett Kavanaugh because now he's a conservative, he's a Christian, he's a white man, he's up for an important position where he could affect conservative ideas in our culture. Oh, you could go after him with a microscope and go back to his elementary school. I'm surprised they didn't go back to his nursery school, and put everything under a microscope and come up with accusations for things that otherwise were maybe unfortunate, but were actually somewhat normal behavior back then. Parties were glorified in movies, drunkenness, free sex, messing around. And even the accusations made by Christine Blasey Ford, if they're true, whether or not that was an attempted rape is subjective. I have a feeling that if that were true, it probably was more that they were horsing around, or he was horsing around, and she didn't like it. And I get that, and that's wrong. But, attempted rape, maybe, maybe not. Either way, it was the kind of behavior that you could actually see it in the movie Animal House with John Belushi. I mean, this is what people were like, oh, that's fun. And his entry into his yearbook shows that he was, culturally in tune with that back then. But he changed. And so now the left can use this as a cudgel against someone like Brett Kavanaugh, when in fact they will ignore it if it's charges brought against one of their own, like, I don't know, Ben Affleck, for example, who, who's been engaged in that kind of behavior, and that gets swept under the rug. It's interesting that suddenly, in a situational sense, they become like hyper moralistic if it suits their purposes. It's not a fundamental belief in a moral code. It's simply situational. It only applies to people who aren't marching to their beat, who aren't moving forward with their leftist agenda, and who dare to defy that agenda. It has nothing to do with any actual objection to free sexual behavior and even to a little coercion, as bad as that is. Now, I'm glad that these things are being brought up. And by the way, just to close, they threw Al Franken under the bus only because they were trying at that time to get at a very serious threat to their culture and to their party and to their politics, and that was the possible election of Roy Moore in Alabama. They lodged, accusations against Roy Moore for dating underage girls, which, by the way, largely was untrue. I'm not suggesting that Moore didn't also. He may also have been, a product of the sexual revolution back then. Let's not forget these things were done probably, again, 35 years ago when he was just discharged from the Army and he was dating young women, probably inappropriately. But again, he was as much a product of this as anyone else. This was probably before Ray Moore became a lawyer and he became a Christian and he became a conservative. So they're using that against him. But in order to do that, all of a sudden the Al Franken stuff was coming out with pictures of him putting his hand on a woman's breast while she was asleep and grimacing into the camera like it was a joke, and being accused of a lot of other stuff that was, pretty gross, but not. He wasn't accused of rape and he wasn't accused of sexual molestation outright. But they had to throw him under the bus anyway because the timing of it didn't look right. They couldn't go after Roy Moore and their agenda to destroy him while Franken's news was breaking all over the place. So they deep sixed him, which is what they do. It's everything. Everyone is expendable. Everyone is convenient. So now here we have today Brett Kavanaugh able to enter, thank God, the U.S. Supreme Court and bring a balance to the court, perhaps for the next 30 years, that I support and that had everything to do with why these charges were brought against him. Believe me, if he had been a liberal Democrat, we would never have heard about his high school yearbook. It just wouldn't have come up because conservatives don't do that anyway. But we still have the lingering Hillary Clinton scandal when she gets up on television and is asked by, of all people, Rachel Maddow, in a moment of honesty, what about the accusations against Clinton where Hillary said, oh, those are false. Why are they false, huh? I mean, this was when he was governor and president, and those are false. And recently when she said that Monica Lewinsky was an adult, somehow that makes it right. So she's poisonous to the left. I wonder what they're going to do about her. We'll see. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on the subject. I want to thank you for watching, everyone. Have a good day.